Greetings. My name is Fida Adani, and I'm the director of the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies, an associate professor, and the Clovis and Hala Salam Maksud Chair in Arab Studies. I'd like to welcome you today to today's event, Gaza, Indigenous Urbanism Amidst Elimination, hosted by the Alwaleed Center for Christian Muslim Understanding, the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies, the African Studies Program, and Georgetown University Qatar. Today marks the first of a 9-event series that our 4 units are collaborating on in conjunction with a class being taught by Dr. Nader Hashemi about Gaza. Before I introduce our speaker, I want to acknowledge that there's an ongoing genocide in Gaza with over 40,000 Palestinians killed by Israeli forces, US-funded Israeli forces, US-funded and supported. Public health experts estimate that the toll is likely much, much higher. We're also witnessing intensified killing, land confiscation, and ethnic cleansing in the West Bank at the hands of Israeli forces and settlers. And that's what brings us here today. I would now like to introduce Dr. Nour Joudah. I'm abbreviating her biography in the interest of time, but her full biography can be found on our website. Dr. Joudah is an assistant professor in the Department of Asian American Studies at UCLA and a former president's and Andrew W. Mellon postdoctoral fellow in geography at UC Berkeley. Dr. Joudah completed her PhD in geography at UCLA and wrote her dissertation, Mapping Decolonized Futures, Indigenous Visions for Hawaii and Palestine, on the efforts by Palestinian and Native Hawaiian communities to imagine and work toward liberated futures, while centering Indigenous duration as a nonlinear temporality. Dr. Joudah is an alumni of the Master of Arts in Arab Studies program at Georgetown, and we are very proud to welcome her back. Gaza forces us to ask questions that challenge our assumptions of not only what defines or qualifies a settler colonial city, but also the relationship of indigeneity to the urban. Gaza's decades under siege highlight the unique forms that settler colonial elimination can take, herding and kettling, confining Palestinians, all the while witnessing them grow and build a city despite ongoing domination of a settler colonial state. Dr. Joudah will discuss these eliminatory models to come as Palestinians in Gaza continue to live through a genocide. I will now read the Georgetown University Speech and Expression Policy. Georgetown University is committed to standards promoting speech and expression that foster the exchange of ideas and opinions. While it is recognized that not everyone may share the same views as the speakers, it is expected that everyone in attendance at this event respect the right of the speaker and the organizing groups to share their perspectives and ideas by not causing a disruption to the event's activities. At the conclusion, there'll be a question and answer session during which you may ask questions and engage in dialogue. At that time, we will ask everyone to please phrase comments in the form of a question. And in the interest of time, we ask that each person be concise and ask only one question, unless of course we have time for others. When we move to the audience Q&A, please simply raise your hand and I'll help moderate the Q&A period. And for those of you on Zoom, the Q&A feature is available online for you to address your questions. I'm going to move over and give the space to our distinguished guest, and then I'll be back up here to help facilitate questions. So with that, we will begin.
Thank you to both centers for having me today, to Professor Nader for having me in his class this morning, to FIDA and the Arab Studies Center. The last time I was in this room, I was defending my master's thesis to Professors Rochelle Davis and Nour Arakat. And today I find myself nervous for a whole different set of reasons. Since last October, my ability to get through a talk on Gaza is a bit of a coin toss, sorry. I tend to make it to the other side relatively in one piece, or some line in the text breaks me early and the rest of the lecture is me trying to regain my composure. So for your sake and mine, let's hope today is the latter. This year has been a series of conversations that I can't get out of my head. One of the many that is forever seared into my brain is my cousin relaying a check-in on her father and sister in Khan Yunis. She heard, as we often do on the phone when we call, the sound of Israeli bombing in the background, and her sister comforted her by saying, "Don't worry, if we can hear the strike, it means we're okay, it means we're alive." They say it's the one you don't hear. Here we go. They say it's the one you don't hear that means you're dead. It's the silent one that takes you out. The next day, I walked by a group of students on my campus, all holding signs for an end to the Israeli aggression. The text in the center of their formation read, "Silence kills." The students and my cousin were obviously talking about starkly different silences, but for weeks, all I could see in flashes between nightmares was that poster paired with the description of hearing your neighbor's erasure as proof of life for yourself. 4 years ago, I wrote an article, a short piece that had also been whirling around in my head for years before I put it into text. It was called Gaza, a Site and Method, the Settler Colonial City Without Settlers. A short piece that was published in 2020. Ironically, the year that the UN had declared that the Gaza Strip would become unlivable. And as it turned out, Gaza hung on for 3 more years. Gaza City and the larger Gaza Strip have become colloquially synonymous in most of the world, using Gaza interchangeably. Even among Palestinians, references to the location can switch in quick succession and without much pause. But at 25 miles long and 4 to 5 miles wide, the Strip also contains several smaller towns surrounding Gaza City, and it houses close to 2.2 million Palestinians, over 70% of whom are refugees. Prior to 1948, the Gaza district was 38 times its size today. And as the largest district in Mandatory Palestine, it consisted of around 90 villages and towns. Almost all of these communities were destroyed by Zionist militias during the Nakba. Most of the refugees in the Gaza Strip today are from these surrounding depopulated villages. And Gaza City, as Gaza City has grown, a once largely rural Palestinian population now resides in or next to one of the world's most densely populated urban areas. Today, 7 years into an air, sea, and land blockade, and almost 1 year of genocidal warfare, we are on the cusp of both a return of settlers to Gaza City and the near total decimation of its once vibrant example of indigenous urbanism. The assertion I put forth in the original article and now is that Gaza forces us to ask questions that challenge our assumptions of not only what defines or qualifies a settler colonial city, but also the relationship of indigeneity to the urban. Now, what I mean by that, geographers and folks in urban studies are obsessed with the process of growth and development as it relates to cities and urban centers. And while dispossession of native populations is involved in the founding of many of these cities, urban analysis has had a very limited engagement with this historical process beyond simply acknowledging colonial settlement to start. Even as geographers and those in urban studies adopt settler colonial analysis that challenges the relegation of indigenous lives and spaces to the rural, the settler colonial city model is still struggling with who it centers and who guides our understanding of it. In settler colonial theory, settler permanence is often discussed or accepted as a political inevitability. Embedded in this assumption is also a deep spatial permanence. This spatial permanence looms and obscures heavily in two significant ways. First, it discourages settler colonial studies as a field from actively pursuing questions on Indigenous-led visions for alternative and decolonial futures. And secondly, and perhaps more importantly for our conversation today, it can obscure settler colonial spaces and our identification of them to depend on the presence of settlers and not the systems that govern Indigenous lives. In the second manner, spaces like Gaza are further marginalized. The 2005 quote-unquote disengagement or settler evacuation attempts to place Gaza outside of the settler colonial relationship, both with Israel as well as its larger Palestinian context, severing its tied fate to the occupied West Bank and Palestinian lands occupied in 1948, on which the Israeli state was established. In the North American context, we often look to sites like Minneapolis or Vancouver, or cities bordering reservations, all valuable and providing insight. But imagine for a moment a fully fledged urban center within the reservation. If settler colonialism's irreducible element is territory, as Wolf reminds us, then what do we make of a sprawling metropolis in spite of its confinement? Abdul Malik Simone challenges us, excuse me, I'm so sorry, in a moment when the working majority is increasingly at the periphery, to situate urban politics itself as periphery politics. So in a field such as geography, where discussions on gentrification and mega complexes and expulsion occupy so much of the work, how do we also incorporate a city like Gaza, a city that spent decades constantly bracing for war, a city that cannot fathom its biggest urban issue being the creation of a periphery within, when its very existence is peripheral? The original article was an argument and an appeal to all of us that Gaza provides us with an opening to place Indigenous lives in an urban landscape, born of Indigenous history, not of colonial settlement, that we can engage Indigenous lives in a fully Indigenous urban center. I cannot help today but reread over and over the central question I posed then about Gaza as a fully Indigenous urban center. Is it settler presence and Indigenous elimination, or Indigenous survival, which qualifies the label settler colonial city? At the time, I answered by arguing that Gaza's circumstance highlighted the unique forms that elimination can take: herding and kettling, confining Palestinians, all the while witnessing them grow and build a city unmarked by settler founding, despite the current domination. Almost a year into this genocide, and I stand by that answer, Gaza will not be erased from history or from the Palestinian landscape. Palestinians will rebuild its structures and repave its roads. It will continue to be defined by its survival. But I would also be dishonest if I did not admit that the question needs adjusting, and that modifications feel impossible and even disrespectful in the current moment. What will Gaza after genocide become? Whose vision will guide the plans ahead? What does settler colonial herbicide mean for the Indigenous in the context of intensifying military occupation and, more importantly, ongoing liberation struggle? Beyond the concrete and the humanitarian aid that will inevitably come flooding in one way or another to Gaza, the Indigenous future at stake here is inextricably tied to urban realities elsewhere in occupied Palestine. In the West Bank, the Palestinian Authority has maintained a stranglehold on Palestinian cities and its residents' responses to the genocide of their brethren less than an hour away. Meanwhile, Israel is confiscating thousands of dunams of land every month in the villages surrounding Palestinian urban centers. bulldozing and bombing neighboring refugee camps as sites of resistance, and arresting thousands of Palestinians across the West Bank at an unprecedented rate. Long before this year, I asked, are we on the precipice of the creation of dozens of Ghazas in the coming months and years? And unfortunately, the answer is yes. The wider Palestinian urban network is not merely a mechanism for us to zoom out in philosophizing, as we say in Arabic, al-falsafa, but to establish that settler colonial cities without settlers, besieged and then subjected to genocide, will become the new model to follow for the Zionist settler regime, in a way and at a rate that we have never witnessed. The world's acquiescence to Israel month after month, as tens of thousands of Palestinians are killed on live broadcast, has all but guaranteed that they will do everything in its power to replicate what Israel has done in Gaza. The open-air prison of Gaza for the last 17 years is a siege coming soon to other smaller Palestinian cities. The death toll via warfare may not be as high, but the deprivation will be even more acute than the blockade of the Strip that we witnessed before October 7th. The herding and kettling to come is less akin to Gaza in 2007 than the creation of the Gaza Strip in 1948, when the district shrunk down 38 times its original size. Some will say that this escalation seems unfathomable, and I would remind them that 4 years ago, they would have said the same of the events of the last year. Like every settler colonial project, Israel is constantly operating to account for its failure to rid itself of the native population. As this failure becomes more pronounced in the face of Palestinian sumud and active resistance, the Zionist state will continue to lash out with the unbridled violence of a wounded predator. The lesson of this past year has gone beyond understanding that Gaza's, quote, very existence is peripheral. The Gaza Strip, made up of a city, towns, and refugee camps, is a periphery filled with people refusing the margins and defying the colonial delusion that they can be rendered peripheral, disposable collateral. On the 345th day of this genocide, we are still nowhere near an after that allows for material speculation. And with every minute that passes, the death toll and regional tension rises. Beyond the over 40,000 Palestinian killed, there are another 10,000 or more missing under rubble or lost in the chaos of displacement and family separation. We know that even if a ceasefire were to go into effect tomorrow, which we also know it will not, the anticipated death toll as a result of the genocidal Israeli policies of the last year will be well over 150,000 Palestinian lives. And somehow, this unfathomable loss does not even scratch the surface of the realities on the ground. Over half of all the homes in the Gaza Strip have been completely destroyed, hundreds of thousands more partially destroyed. Since the invasion of Rafah in May, almost every resident of the Strip has been displaced at least once, if not several times. Every university in Gaza has been bombed. The healthcare infrastructure has been decimated, and hospitals have been used as jails and execution sites. Thousands of Palestinian men and women have been forcibly disappeared and are still detained in either known prisons or black sites. Polio, long eradicated from the area, has returned. Almost 200 journalists have been killed. No neighborhood remains recognizable, and no Palestinian in Gaza has been spared the Israeli policies of starvation and of elimination by any means necessary. The Zionist attempt at total elimination has been laid bare and live streamed to a degree that many of us would have never imagined. And for others of us, we hoped our instincts that this day was coming would be proven wrong. Instead, The nightmare deepens and darkens as we wade through grief and rage. We knew this was coming, and we know it will not end with Gaza. But what we do not know is how many more Gazas the world will allow. Palestinians in Gaza are not surviving a genocide, they are living through it. They are living through it together as they take in their neighbors, as they clean half-destroyed buildings to re-inhabit and remake homes between the rubble, as women gather by the dozens to create community kitchens that turn bags of aids into meals that nourish hundreds. They can live through the genocide together in these ways because of the ways that they have been surviving together for decades, bound in common purpose and a belief that their collective will outlives every catastrophe. 2 weeks before the Israeli military invaded Rafah, my aunts and cousins still in their homes were contemplating and preparing for what seemed at the time like an unfathomable evacuation, preemptively buying tents and setting up elsewhere so that when the order came, they could move quickly and with a set destination, knowing all the while that no destination promised safety. The fact that displacement has acquired a standard operating procedure in Gaza today should tell us all we need to know about the losses in Palestine's largest urban center and its surrounding areas. 2 months into their stay in the tents of Mawasi near Khan Yunis, the safe zone was bombed, burning alive. And ripping apart dozens of men, women, and children. My family survived the attack in July, but 2 days later, my Aunt Alia died from complications of heat exhaustion, the tents acting like an oven under the summer sun. My cousin Saleh, her eldest son, said that she hadn't been the same since he lost his 2 boys, Hussein and Muhammad, weeks earlier. Something in her broke when they told her about her grandsons. Alwaleed Joudah did not die in a missile strike, but she was a martyr of this genocide nonetheless. She was 8 or 9 years old during the Nakba. Her life started in Astud, and her childhood was swallowed up by refugeedom and helping parent her younger siblings. And her final year on Earth was spent as a witness to this genocide of her people and the destruction of her home. Despite all the despair, she lived, guided by immeasurable love for everyone in her presence. She never saw herself in need and always directed donors looking to help elsewhere in the community. Alia died surrounded by the love of her children, the love she spent her life giving away. But she deserved to have so many more of us with her. Until the day she died, she would answer Isdud to the question, "Where are you from?" But her love for and belonging to Rafah was immense. Gaza City and its towns do not exist because of colonial settlement, to be sure. Their history precedes any notion of a Zionist city. The other side of that coin, however, is that a large majority of the Palestinians who inhabit Gaza are there because of settler colonial dispossession and displacement. Together with Palestinians from Gaza, Khan Yunis, Rafah, Deir al-Balah, and many more towns, they all remade Gaza in their image, turning refugee camps into thriving centers of education and innovation, and small villages into small cities. In turn, Gaza remade them in its image as well, fortified, determined, and defiant. Thank you.
I want to start by thanking you, Noor, because one of the hardest things about being at an institution like this and having events is the ways in which we kind of are forced to perform this kind of, you know, calm, cool, and collected engagement with the genocide, which is unfolding before our eyes. So I'm sorry that you have to talk to us about this. And, but I am thankful that you are reminding us all of the weight of what we are all witnessing. And we shouldn't be able to talk about this without getting emotional. So I want to thank you for doing that. I really do.
Fill the room.
Yeah. Who's gonna ask a question now?
No.
No, we'll open it up. We'll open it up for questions. I can start while everyone thinks about it.
Yeah.
I mean, I have so many questions and none at the same time, because I feel like. But I was thinking about where you started with this. Well, I was thinking about this question of urbanism, because that's your focus. But this is not a field I'm very familiar with, so. And I was thinking about something that you just said towards the end. Well, your first piece that you wrote about Gaza as method.
Yeah.
And I wonder, as you kind of witness what's happening right now, what you think about the kind of the implications of what is happening in Gaza. So you've talked about many Gazas in Palestine, but many people at this moment have been thinking about Palestine and Gaza as kind of the struggle for decolonizing the world, or the model for the elimination, right?
Yeah.
So the optimistic is that this is the battle, this is decolonization, and that the Palestinian struggle is the inspiration for all of us, right? The flip side of that is, or the dark side of that is, this could be done to anyone, or could it be, right? This kind of thinking through this question is, what does this mean for us as a society? To be able to watch this unfold. And so I was thinking about that in relation to the fact that you're bringing up Gaza to push folks in your own field to think differently about settler colonialism and its relationship to space. So maybe that's my question, right? It's kind of like, what are the broader implications? Yeah.
I think it can happen anywhere. And I think what's been so frustrating in the last year for so many of us of conscience is that we know that it can happen anywhere. And yet that doesn't seem to be enough to move the world into action. As for academic disciplines and their engagement or lack thereof, I mean, I certainly can't. I would be interested if someone else can name one. I can't imagine one. A discipline or a field at this point that does not have many lessons to learn from Gaza in the last year and from Palestine as a whole. And I think that that also speaks to our level of responsibility in our research and as academics to not only look at places, right, as sites for extraction of information and the utility that we have in using them to further theory or enrich research, but understanding the ways that we are tied to the livelihoods and the lived experiences of those places, whether that's via understanding how our tax dollars are spent here in the US, whether it's understanding the shared police training between police departments in the United States and Israeli military, or whether it is, you know, in a space like the Center for Arab Studies, also understanding you know, what the creation of Israel has done to the region over the last 80 years in so many ways. And the dynamics that it creates as a result, and that we allow authoritarian regimes in the region to manipulate to their benefit. So there's so much there for so many of us. And I think whether it's theoretical implications or conducting case studies or whatever it might be, the responsibility that we have to engage with Gaza and to learn from it, to write through Gaza and not just on Gaza is incredibly important right now, more than ever. And it's not because Gaza should be siloed off from the rest of Palestine. It's that it is emblematic of what is happening everywhere else. It is just perhaps the current harshest example of that version of elimination, but it is certainly not the only one.
You have a question right here? Yeah.
Gaza is about twice the size of Washington DC. And it has more than like 3 times the population, but it also has like farming areas,
That's right.
yeah, non-urban areas that are. So to help us understand,
Yeah.
what would it be like for if what happened in Gaza would happened here? What was for the infrastructure here, for the people here?
You wouldn't see anything you see looking out the window now. I mean, there are some incredible maps. I probably should have included some in the slides. I didn't, I apologize. But if you were to lay over a map of Gaza onto Los Angeles, for example, you would cover lengthwise from LAX all the way up to Pasadena. For Northern Virginia, to give you a sense, it would cover most of Northern Virginia and plus all of DC and into Maryland. So everything that you really understand as the DMV would be kind of covered by that space. Now, if we understand that 70% of structures, 80% of structures have been destroyed or damaged, you would not be able to walk 50 feet in any direction without hitting rubble of some kind. Is the best I can sort of give you a sense of. But I'm not sure that any of us, even those there, have a level of comprehension. I mean, when you talk to folks in Gaza today, partly because of the way that the war has been structured by Israel, the way that the genocide has been executed, there is so much separation of populations from each other in Gaza, right? And this is very intentional to separate the north from the middle, from the south. And a result of that is that outside of the snippets of internet that come to people or their ability to get news and so on, they also have not seen other parts of Gaza from where they are, aside from where they have been displaced. And I think that is a shock factor that no one is prepared for. For someone from Rafah to actually make the walk all the way to northern Gaza and see what has become of the entire strip, I don't wish that on anybody. I really don't.
Okay. Yeah.
Thank you for your words and knowledge and everything shared. As we think about rebuilding, a question that keeps me focused is how do we continue to show up when Palestinians begin to rebuild and when they begin to repair? And I'd love to understand in terms of your question on Indigenous survival and settler colonial cities and those definitions, how does access to resources, materials, machinery, technology, and innovation kind of play into that definition for you?
Yeah, I mean, there are a couple of things, right? One is, and this is something that comes up a lot in urban studies, and I'm not an urbanist, but I work on Gaza, so I employ a lot of things in regards to them. But folks who work on architecture, urbanists, and so on, and brilliant people who work in places like Beirut Urban Labs, or who put on phenomenal conferences like City Debates at American University in Beirut every year. One of the first things that they'll tell you is that there is a big difference between rebuilding and recovery. And that's something that I always repeat in these sort of spaces and scenarios as we have these conversations, because you can put a building back up, but what that means for revitalizing an entire neighborhood or an entire city are very, very different things, right? And you, of course, allude to that yourself. And part of that recovery is going to be not just about rebuilding a campus, but the sort of, I mean, if you think about Georgetown, you think about this campus, if a building comes down, the trauma that comes with that building coming down, right? The conversation around that, the experiences around that, what it means to rebuild a department, to rebuild your classrooms, to feel like you can sit in a classroom again, is very different than a donor saying, here's 5 million, rebuild the building, right? And so, you know, mental health care is going to be a huge part of everything that's to come. And I will say there's been a lot of, I mean, it'll never be near enough, but there's been a lot of progress on that in Gaza in the last 10 years. I mean, it's been decimated in the last year, but I only point to that to say that there has been it's been a long time coming, and there's been a growing acceptance in the region, but also specifically in Gaza within Palestine, about mental health services, particularly for children. This is anecdotal, but I would fight anyone who says that at least 50% of Gaza prior to the war wasn't on antidepressants.
Could you repeat that?
I would say about half of adults in Gaza are on antidepressants. And I don't, I mean, I say that with a lot of love. I don't say that with any sort of stigmatization or judgment or anything. It's been a very, I mean, it's been almost 2 decades of siege and war after war after war. And there has been, I think, an acceptance, a healthy acceptance that we have to take care of ourselves and we have to take care of each other. And there's a lot of that comes culturally and traditionally with the kinds of community care that exist. But there's also a level that care is unable to reach at this point. And I've been thinking in the last year, not only about all of those folks that have come off of kidney dialysis or have ended their chemo treatments, or folks with diabetes who aren't getting their insulin, but also these folks with mental health, just everyday mental health struggles that are just trying to make it through the day, let alone, just breathe, like not find themselves ending the day under rubble. So there's just so much there when we talk about what recovery entails. And there's so many ways. I can't imagine, in the same regards of like, there isn't a discipline that can't learn something from what's happening. There isn't anyone who doesn't have a skill that they could contribute in what would be recovery in Gaza. Now, that doesn't mean I think the whole world needs to fly to Gaza, but there will be ways. There will be ways for people to plug in. There already are. If we look at universities, there are already systems being set up for online classes. I mean, in the middle of February, there were students in Gaza defending doctoral dissertations and master's theses in the middle of tents. And we struggle to get up for 9 a.m. classes. So, I'm just saying, there's a level of dedication and heart that's there, and sumud, the steadfastness that's there, that I think is important for us to keep in mind and to center. And then I don't remember the second part of your question. I'm sorry.
The second part was just, as you were talking about, how indigenous urbanism has looked like in Gaza and the history that it's come out of.
Yeah.
How does the access to materials, resources, technology, and the siege impact that and impact the innovation, impact?
Yes, so one thing, we don't have the presentation up anymore. If there, there was a slide that had, if we can show it. There was a slide that had images of Gaza pre-October 7th, like a greenhouse and kind of, the urban center and so on. And I put that there to make a point, right there. So that corniche, or the sort of ocean drive that you see along the coast, almost all of that was built after 2014. It was actually a part of the post-2014 war recovery. There are obviously huge parts of Gaza that are that have been around for much longer. I mean, the Omri Mosque being destroyed was just heartbreaking. I mean, this is a piece of architecture and history that's been around for centuries. You have that kind of historical depth in the city, not to mention archaeological sites, and so on. But then you also have this kind of imagery, which is that, they've also, it's not even for better or for worse, have become accustomed to what recovery looks like and what rebuilding looks like. It's part of the reason that you find so many people in Gaza speaking to the media so fortified and defiant, because they've already rebuilt houses and they know what that looks like. That said, I mean, we cannot by any stretch of the imagination compare 2014 to what has happened in the last year at all. But there is a lot of innovation in what rebuilding looks like, including how to repurpose rubble, which is something that we don't talk a lot about when you see these articles. And doesn't mean that these articles aren't important. These articles that talk about how long it takes to clear rubble, right? Mm-hmm. Yes, it takes a very long time. And even if we were to flood with bulldozers and every piece of equipment needed, it would take a very long time. But there's also levels of assumption there as to where the rubble is going, which would not, in my opinion, necessarily be the case if and when Gaza engineers are the ones running that show. Right. So there are a lot of, and I'm not by any stretch of the imagination a person who should be speaking to the science of that. But I know enough to know that there are methods and processes that have already sort of been perfected and used in recent years. And I imagine and hope that that would occur again.
So I have a bunch of folks with questions in the audience, but there's one online that's related to this question of rebuilding from Rochelle Davis. She says, can you tell us a bit about your newly published article on the Palestine Land Society Village Rebuilding Competition in terms of thinking about return?
Yeah, so for folks who maybe haven't heard of it, there is a competition by an organization called Palestine Land Society, which is also an organization that published and continues to publish other materials, but published most famously the Atlas of Palestine. And in it, Palestinian architecture students are charged with this assignment of redesigning a destroyed village from 1948. And they are given a brief that includes a set of information, including perhaps old village maps, a breakdown of the land, what the population of that village was pre-1948, as well as demographic estimates of how many descendants are alive today from that village. And then they are charged with this task of redesigning the village on the old site. And the designs that come out of it are absolutely incredible, but more interesting are the processes that they think through in order to get to that design. Some of the shared features that we see are things like return hostels and hotels, which is really speaking to this understanding that obviously not everyone in the diaspora would go back, but we have to account for spaces in these villages that would, where we would have spaces for these people to kind of be and be a part of the community and be a part of the conversation. Town squares, schools, obviously, a lot of memorials, museums, things like this are common features. There was one in particular that I highlight in the article that's one of my favorites, where it's a group of students that actually decide they're not going to redesign the whole village. They're going to put everyone in, they create, it's called Ain Ghazal, and they sort of revive the Ain, or the spring of this town. And they create a structure that kind of looks like a dam, and it has multiple floors. And that's where everyone would live kind of in the interim period. They rebuild the water, right, of the spring. It sort of follows behind this dam. And everyone would live together in sort of in this structure, this fortified structure. And they would redesign the village together, right? And that project to me was really beautiful and interesting, because the students said towns and cities and villages grow organically. They don't grow because a planner came in and said XYZ is what the heart of these neighborhoods will be. They have to be able to grow on their own. We're not trying to create a second Israeli settlement in the place of this land, right? And so it's the villagers and the residents of Ain Ghazal that have to guide that conversation. And I think that there's a lot to learn from that example in particular as we move into what recovery for Gaza looks like, and who we're putting in charge of and having lead the conversation of what that recovery is defined as.
Samia, did you still have a question?
Yeah, so just to build off, I mean, I felt like so much of what you were talking about is, and it kind of builds on Jen and Lula's work on urban apartheid in an interesting way. But I was gonna ask a historical question, I'm sorry. If you could sort of take us back to the beginning of the blockade, specifically the blockade that was imposed on building material, on cement, on pipes, metal, the intentionality of banning those materials from entering Gaza, and then how that fits in, obviously, with the sort of resilience of, despite that, we still see urban development.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the ability to overcome the siege is the tunnels. You know, the tunnels in press are pointed to as merely, and it's not to say they don't have this component, but as merely this means by which to for the resistance to operate, to hide out, to smuggle weapons, but it was also a way to get food. I mean, for years, the Rafah tunnels were the main source of any building materials, a washer, a plier, screws coming into Gaza were all coming in through the tunnels. There was nothing that Israel was allowing in. And so, you know, the tunnels served that purpose. And the ability that you talk about to kind of go around the siege, even though it by no stretch of the imagination was able to overcome it completely, was in large part due to the tunnels, and was in large part due to things like how to repurpose rubble, solar energy. I mean, the amount of solar energy that Gaza runs on is incredible, or ran on. For quite a while in the early part of the war, the reason people had power was because most of the buildings that hadn't been bombed out and then got covered by ash, so then they weren't able to function anymore, most of them were running on solar panels. Their electricity was running on solar panels. So, you know, necessity is what's the saying? Necessity is the
Mother of invention. Yeah.
Look at that. So, and Gaza is certainly a prime example of that.
So we got Elliot, and then Nader, and then I saw a hand here, maybe? Okay, then we'll go there. Yeah.
Thank you, Nour, for
I
the
know.
talk today. About 40 years ago, I was taken to a Syrian city, used to be a big city called Quneitra in Golan Heights, and our guide sort of walked us through the various, it's totally destroyed.
Yeah.
And in fact, it was a laboratory for the IDF to practice destroying sections of the city on a mass scale. And it made a big impression on me as a teenager to see that a state would spend so much time to destroy a city as completely, it was like a laboratory.
Yeah.
Still standing as they keep it as sort of a museum. And later I saw, Israeli settlements in Sinai that have been systematically destroyed. So as I'm thinking of this, I'd rather talk about rebuilding and recovery, but I do want to ask as a geographer,
Yeah.
are there any sort of big patterns you notice in terms of urban elimination? Like, what are the patterns of destruction that you see? Because they've been practicing this stuff for an awfully long time. And I would just love to know, like, your thoughts on that.
I can live here back.
Yeah, sorry. Oh, my bad, I just got confused. It's at a different, so I mean, I was just thinking of a different slide presentation. I mean, one of the things that we see, right, in 48 is the movement, right, to major centers, and sort of this emptying of rural spaces into urban centers. But also one of the things that we see, so if we kind of go out of this historical aspect and we go in this part, I mean, the actual, what we know today is the strip, right? One of the things we talked about in Professor Hashmi's class this morning is there have been phases of evacuations, right? And phases of displacement, quote unquote, evacuations, phases of displacement in the last year. There was the one that we remember the most, I think, from the beginning, which is the evacuation from the north to the south that empties out Gaza and kind of pushes everyone into the middle area and to Rafah. And then, of course, follows the invasion of Khan Yunis, which pushes everyone further south and to the coast. And then comes the invasion of Rafah, where everyone is moved back into the middle. And so one of the things that you see is about constant motion and reconcentration. I was actually watching a documentary on Puerto Rico recently, and came to find that the Spanish had a very similar method as a means by which to suppress resistance to Spanish colonial powers, indigenous resistance, Spanish colonial powers in Puerto Rico, which was constant reconcentration and moving folks from rural into sort of smaller spaces. And this is something that we see across the world. I mean, I only use the example of Puerto Rico, but it's not uncommon, certainly, and it is also a tactic of disorienting those who are displaced, right? And of disorienting the resistance to also from an armed resistance capacity. But from a civilian capacity, you are brought further to the brink of desperation with every displacement. And in today's world, with the technology that we have, people are getting photos sent to them from neighbors of their destroyed homes after they've left. So family that we have who left Rafah and are now in Khan Yunis have gotten sent pictures from people in Rafah who remained of what the neighborhood looks like now. And they are sitting in Khan Yunis, living in, bombed out houses, knowing that there's nothing to go back to. And that in and of itself, right, is a tactic of the elimination. And there are plenty of folks, whether it's Quneitra or whether it's the hundreds of destroyed villages in Palestine, that will tell you that, yes, there are obviously these attempts by groups like the JNF, Jewish National Fund, and others to grow trees over some of these places to kind of hide the dispossession. But there's also something, I think, in settler colonial ideology that's powerful, which is to leave remnants of indigenous spaces as remnants and to be able to point to them and say, look what we can do.
Yeah.
And so it's not, it's never an either or, I think, in these scenarios.
Yeah, this is a good segue to my question, but I just want to preface it by echoing what Fida said at the beginning of this event. This is obviously a horrific moment for all of us, and the moral challenge that we all face is how do we respond to a genocide, particularly one which our government is facilitating?
Yeah.
And I think as a minimum, the moral responsibility that we all have is to bear witness, to record this, hoping that our collective efforts will make a difference down the road. So you being here is, I think, bearing witness. It's helping us sort of at least mark this moment, and hopefully something good will come down the road. The question that I want to answer, which is really a segue from your last comment, has to do with your PhD dissertation research. And you're one of the few people, as far as I know, that has actually studied and compared Palestine with the case of Hawaii. And so when we think about colonial settler states and indigenous survival and resistance, I guess the question would be, what does the case of Hawaii what do we learn from that case that helps us understand what's going on in Palestine today? What are the similarities? There's obviously differences, but could you speak to that question?
Yeah. So originally the project was supposed to be 3 cases, which included Algeria. For a number of reasons, Algeria kind of had to get scaled back in the project, though it's still in the larger dissertation. All 3 for me are prime examples of not only cases that do not fit into sort of settler colonial studies obsession with the British Dominion sort of model of settler colonies, but also are an insistence that we move away from the categories that are so employed by the field and so employed by settler colonial sort of frameworks and theories of analysis.
Categories like what?
So one of them is the elimination of native labor, right? So one of many ways in which people try to quote unquote disqualify Algeria is that the elimination of native labor does not come to fruition at that particular point in the timeline when the War of Independence sort of begins. And the idea that any one thing disqualifies something from being a settler colony is both absurd and counterproductive to what we do, right? It doesn't help for us to kind of think about these spaces as silos. And Hawaii, for me, I was drawn to for a number of reasons. One was that I wanted to include a US site, but also I think there are a lot of really amazing people and indigenous scholars that are doing work on the quote unquote mainland, which no one in Hawaii would agree with as a term, but and nor should they, right, of what we understand as sort of the contiguous today United States of settler colony. And I wanted to not kind of focus on a reservation situation or that, and Hawaii provided that. But more than anything, I'm forever baffled that of everything America has done, Hawaii is the only thing it's ever apologized for, which I just think is crazy. I mean, not that it's crazy to apologize to Hawaii, but it's crazy that it's the only thing the United States has ever apologized for. And yet, even with the fact that it's the only thing it's ever apologized for, was the quote illegal overthrow of the Hawaiian kingdom, and the fact that annexation never actually happens in legal terms, right? And yet that was 1993 and nothing. I mean, there's been nothing since the apology. And it's obviously a ton of indigenous organizing and struggle by the Kanaka Maoli in Hawaii. But as far as the US government sort of attitude towards Hawaii as a state, as an occupied space, the way that it deals with its military bases on Hawaii, let alone not has it changed, it's gotten significantly worse, right? So for me, Hawaii provided, there was some just natural intellectual curiosity around it, but also was another instance of sort of not fitting into this classic, easy British Dominion kind of timeline. And then for me also, as someone interested in transnational solidarities and organizing, Hawaii is an incredible space because there has been a Palestine solidarity movement that has been building in Hawaii for 20, 25 years now, and is one of the most incredible examples that I've ever had the honor and privilege to be around of what it means to see a trans-Indigenous space, and to have conversations around Indigenous struggle and decolonization in a way that you just don't in other spaces. And for lack of a better explanation or term, folks who don't have to explain certain things to, but gives you an incredible potential to explain things to other people who are not in that space. Yeah.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, you talk a lot about how kind of the culture and Gaza self-determined to an extent within the confines of like Israeli occupation and control. How is the West Bank with the PA's collaborative, more direct colonial control of like, daily life differentiated from Gaza in that way? Like how has their culture formed different?
Well, wait, how far back do you want to go? So if we're going, no, it's a good question. It's a really good question. The simplest part of that period or to answer is post 2005, and removing the settlements is not a small thing, despite the fact that the siege is what follows, right? To live in Gaza for the last almost 20 years now without Israeli settlements, right? There is an entire generation that has known what it means to live in a Palestinian urban space that is solely a Palestinian urban space. That is not an insignificant or small thing, right? They are very aware of the siege. They are very aware of the wars. It's just not as if they're, living freely. But to not have your movement blocked to be able to drive from Rafah to Jabalia, right, from the southernmost to the northernmost, or Beit Hanun, in the Gaza Strip, and be unable to drive from Ramallah to Jerusalem or from Bethlehem to Ramallah is that is a very significant difference in not only your day-to-day life, but sort of your psyche. My friend and colleague who co-taught the class this morning with me, Jihad, made a point of mentioning, I think importantly so, that up until this last year, up until this genocide, Gaza was the largest piece of contiguous Palestinian territory. Now imagine, Gaza is the size of it, and then imagine the size of the West Bank. And yet Gaza is the largest space of contiguous Palestinian territory that is not broken up. That means you cannot go that distance anywhere in the West Bank without hitting a checkpoint, without hitting a settlement, without hitting a roadblock, you know what I mean? So that has a lot to do with also how resistance grows in those spaces. And if you want to go much farther back than that, whether it's the post-67 period or whether it's the pre-48 to 67 period, Egypt and Jordan administer those spaces very differently. And I am not giving Egypt any sort of props for anything these days. But the way that Egypt sort of quote unquote administered or functioned in the Gaza Strip was also allowed, even if it was done in secret, allowed for a growth of resistance that was very difficult in the Jordanian occupied West Bank. And that had to do with politics, had to do with the way that it was administered. It also has to do with demographics, right? We go back to this question of 70% of the population being refugees. The West Bank is certainly dealing with dispossession and displacement and arrest and occupation. But there are also a lot of people in the West Bank who are still living in their homes. at a rate and at a sort of percentage that does not exist in the Gaza Strip, particularly in the 48 to 67 period, right? So all of these things create various dynamics, and that's, that's full on semester of conversation.
There's a question in the chat kind of related to this, and you've spoken to it a little bit, but about kind of how this confined space and density, population density leads to certain forms of self-sufficiency. The question is particularly about agriculture. Yeah.
Prior to the siege, Gaza's two biggest imports were flowers and strawberries. They were known for having the best of both. At one point in the early 2000s, they were the largest exporter of carnations to the Netherlands, the home of flowers.
Wow.
So there is, while a lot of development, as Sarah Roy and others brilliantly lay out, there is a creativity around creating around developing ulterior sort of economies. And a lot of that does get shut down by the siege. And you see these greenhouses become repurposed for more sort of self-sufficient kind of agriculture of food. But certainly not enough, which is also a part of the reason, and is also one of the many logics of settler colonialism, which is and colonialism in general, right, which is keeping people dependent on avenues of food systems and resources, and they become a captive consumer base, right? So there are very specific items that you can only get from Israeli brands. And so Gaza becomes a captive kind of economy to the Israeli market. That said, there is agricultural land in Gaza, despite its small size. And that has been absolutely decimated in the last year. And one of the many things that that are going to be sort of parts of conversations around recovery, whatever that looks like, is also the environmental devastation that we have seen, and the impacts of chemicals from these bombs that are seeping into the groundwater, and what that is going to mean for decades to come of ability or lack thereof to grow food, and likely a lot of cancers that are going to develop that have not been seen in the area for a long time.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, that's okay.
I have a question about choosing the term strip.
Mhm.
That's it, and you see it used in English language, there's not an equivalent in Arabic.
Well, we say Qatar Gaza. I mean, we do say Qatar Gaza, but you don't see it in Arabic prior to 48. Yeah.
Do you think that this use might be misleading or might be like sideway off Gaza, and this way it makes it feel like it's some like off limb that's just hanging around?
I mean, I think what's more important is the actions and policies that are actively siloing off and attempting to marginalize Gaza and have been building for a long time. So yes, but I don't think Qatar is like the thing that we point to as what's doing that work for the Israelis. And the thing is, Qatar Gaza as a term, as I mentioned earlier, in sort of the shrinking down of the larger district and of the sub-district. So everything in yellow is actually the larger Gaza district. It included Bir Saba, or Muhafazat al-Nakhab. And then the sub-district of Gaza that you see there that's marked is the one that we sort of think of. The lines that make up what is the Gaza district, or Gaza Strip today, are not borders. It's as Jihad mentioned this morning, it's an armistice line, and it's nothing more than an armistice line. These are not borders between nations or populations or spaces that were configured as such via any development of a collective memory. It is an armistice line. And I'm all for pushing back, you know, we can push back against the term as much as we like, but I don't think that the problem is the way that the term strip is being employed. I mean, we say Qata Gaza in Arabic and people in Gaza say it, and there are a lot of terms that we push back against. That's not one that you really hear like much sort of conversation around. I'm more concerned with saying things like Aradi 48 or 48 lands for Israel instead of saying Israel than I am concerned about, you know, saying strip for Gaza. And I think, but I mean, I think it's great to like constantly recontextualize Gaza as this is what Gaza has become, as opposed to what Gaza was, and as opposed to what the South was, what Southern Palestine was. I think that's important always, yeah.
So we have two more questions. Or so a bunch more, we can only take two more. So I'm gonna take, Natalie, did you have a question? I heard your hand earlier. Do you still have a question?
Yeah, but
Okay, please.
Oh, perhaps you've touched on this before, but could you say something about Israeli restrictions on foreign journalists from entering and reporting on Gaza, not just from what people call the West, but from the rest of the world?
Yeah.
And as well as censorship, either officially or informally imposed or self-imposed on Israeli media on presenting images of what is going on in Gaza.
Yeah, so the first part, I mean, certainly, may they rest in peace, the almost 200 journalists who have been killed, many of whom directly assassinated and targeted in Gaza in the last year, are local Palestinians, right? Working as journalists, working as stringers for other organizations, freelancing and so on. And a large part of that is because of a huge responsibility that has fallen to them because of a lack of presence of journalists from other countries. They have been severely, as you mentioned, limited in their ability to go in. And when they have gone in, there have been a couple of cases where they've gone in when Rafah was open, through Rafah, did a one-day story and left. And the majority of other journalists that went in the early, particularly early months of the ground invasion, went in on Israeli tanks. They went in as embedded journalists and with the IDF, and obviously had a lot of what they saw limited. They were given presentations. These are the guys that were sort of taken around Shifa Hospital and, you know, pitched a story. And then as soon as they left, we got all the actual images of what was happening via Palestinian journalists and places like Al Jazeera and so on. And then what was the
Internal.
Israeli
Oh,
journalism, yeah.
so what's interesting is there is a level of censorship. I mean, they've kicked Al Jazeera out altogether of you know, places like Tel Aviv and Haifa, of the proper quote unquote Israeli state. And so you see a level of censorship there that is quite high. That said, I mean, Israeli media is more honest about covering the war than CNN or MSNBC or anyone in the United States, not only in their full-throated sort of debates and, I mean, insane genocidal language that is used sort of at roundtables and so on, that one is exposed to if they're able to get the translations of or speak Hebrew, or if not, to get the translations of these segments. But also, like, they admitted and covered things like how many Israeli civilians were killed as a result of the Hannibal Directive on October 7th, directly by the IDF, months before it even started leaking into the US press, right? And so what is happening in the US press is really what is the most mind-boggling, to be honest with you. Because for some, if one reads Hebrew, or one can get, or one has the dedication to go out and just click Google Translate and read those pieces, or read the subtitles of videos readily available on YouTube and other places from Israeli press, the narrative is nowhere near what's being presented in the US. The difference is that the Israelis are fine with it, and if the American media saw, or if the American public saw half of what is being presented in Israeli media, it would have the potential, I won't give America too much credit, would have the potential to shift conversation. But that's not what's happening.
So we have time for one more question? Yep.
So I kind of have two things I want to ask about. First is the closing of the Rafah crossing
Yeah.
has definitely shifted Palestinians' day-to-day existence today.
Yeah.
But also, longer term, if it continues, how educational curriculum is getting, as well as institutional capacity beyond food and water and electricity and engineering capability.
Yeah.
And so just like the conversation about like, now that we have a depth of education as an institution in Gaza, and people compare Gaza's destruction with potentially just how much better connected the West Bank is to the world and why that might be a deterrent to destruction, as if there's kind of this equivalence. But the question basically is, what institutions on the ground remain that now that the Rafah crossing has been closed, that comes from the health sector, from already existing instinctual family relations, the tribes that the tribal chieftains, right, that Israel wanted to use, and then killed half of them.
That's
Yeah, so on and so forth. Like what is local to the Palestinian existence in Gaza that is sustainable beyond Egypt, Jordanian, or American Israeli?
I mean, first of all, Israel throws around tribal like the way the British threw around God knows what. So let's not even wade into that mess of language, because that's I'm not gonna engage with how absurd that is at this point. That said, I mean, cutting off Rafah was huge for a lot of reasons, not the least of which was, you know, there were hundreds of people leaving every day, and there was some aid that was coming in, though very, very limited. But now there is actually nowhere to go and no way out. And so what was already kind of shooting fish in a barrel has become that times 100. As for things like curriculum and these kind of questions around education, listen, the internet has done wonders, and people are not, I mean, yes, we need the connection, we need internet to be able to do certain things, we need electricity. But if the last thing, as heartbreaking as it sounds to me and many other people, that comes into Gaza is a book, we can get them a PDF. That is not the problem at this point. You know, we are talking way above the question of how are we getting in books and materials to classrooms. It is critical, it is important. But if people can figure out how to turn rubble into a building, believe me, Gaza's teachers can figure out how to build a lesson plan without 30 books for each kid. The bigger question is, where are the teachers? How many of those teachers have we lost? I mean, the amount of loss, we don't even know. There is so much that we don't know. There is so much that is uncounted. How many of these kids are going to walk back into a classroom? Let's assume they even make it back to their neighborhoods, walk back into a classroom and find that none of their classmates are still alive. You know, so the challenges ahead for a Palestinian classroom are so much bigger than what happens with the Rafah crossing. The Rafah crossing is incredibly important because it is the only border crossing for people. And it is Gaza's only connection to the outside world. Much more so than a question of how does it tie into sort of an infrastructure rebuild, though also incredibly important. I mean, if the international community wanted to, you know, exert the kind of pressure, you can get things through Karam Salem, you can get things through Erez, you can, Rafah, the importance of Rafah is it as a crossing for people, as a land border. And as far as a deterrent, the only deterrent to destruction and to death is an arms embargo. That's it. You have to cut them off at the knees. That is the only way the Zionist regime stops killing Palestinians. You stop giving them ammunition to do it. There's no other deterrent.
And that's a good place to end. Thank you so much.